Welcome to Slack Signal X. Today, Generation X and the psychedelic renaissance of the 90s. How it shaped us then, and how it's shaping us now. This was the last moment before the great unraveling, before every answer lived in your pocket, before rebellion got repackaged as a streaming service. The 90s weren't just about flannel and ironic detachment. They were one long, unfiltered, neon-lit question mark. And buried beneath the noise, something else was happening. Psychedelics were back. Not in a tie-dye peace sign kind of way, but in underground warehouses, in university psych labs, and behind the closed doors of a rising tech revolution. For a generation raised on the artificial, TV dinners, corporate mascots, prepackaged identities, psychedelics weren't about escapism. They were about breaking the signal, turning into something raw, something real, in a world that was increasingly fake. Psychedelics in the 90s weren't a hippie daydream. They were a password to a secret world where everything was possible. Nothing was certain. A world that would soon be digitized, monetized, and locked behind a paywall. But for a while, it was wide open. Before we get into it, please like, subscribe, and most of all, don't be a poser. 1. Generation X, the counterculture that wasn't supposed to exist. Gen X was never supposed to be a movement. They weren't organized. They weren't out in the streets demanding change. They were the first generation raised on corporate lies and empty promises. Boomers had Woodstock. Millennials had social media activism. Gen X, late night infomercials, cigarette smoking cartoon camels, and a creeping realization that the world was rigged before we even started. So we drifted into punk shows, into underground film, into the kind of music you had to hunt down in sleazy record shops that smelled like dust. And for some, into psychedelics. Not as an escape, but as an act of quiet rebellion, a middle finger to a world that had already written them off. LSD, mushrooms, ecstasy. It wasn't about peace and love. It was about shaking the etch-a-sketch, breaking the monotony. And for a generation drowning in apathy, it was one of the only things that actually worked. 2. The psychedelic renaissance, where it started. Psychedelics in the 90s weren't a throwback. They were an evolution. The old LSD culture of the 60s had been driven underground, demonized, turned into a cautionary tale. But underground movements don't die. They just mutate. By the early 90s, a new scene had emerged. Less about flower crowns and more about neon strobes and warehouse basements. The UK had already embraced the movement, dosing up and dancing in fields long before the US caught on. But once it hit American soil, it was something else entirely. Raves, desert gatherings, word-of-mouth parties in cities where you had to call a number from a payphone just to find out where to go. The music was different, the attitude was different, but the drugs were back. Ecstasy, acid, mushrooms, not as party favorites, but as tools, as keys to unlock something beyond the crushing weight of 9-to-5 existence. And for a generation raised on irony and detachment, they actually felt like something. 3. The unlikely role of psychedelics in the internet revolution. Here's where it gets really weird. Psychedelics weren't just fueling underground parties. They were fueling the very thing that would eventually kill them. The internet. The counterculture kids weren't the only ones experimenting. The Silicon Valley pioneers, the ones who built the digital world we live in today, they were tripping too. Steve Jobs actually called LSD one of the most important things he ever did. Early computer programmers saw it as a way to unlock new dimensions of thought. The very idea of cyberspace, the interconnected, boundaryless, mind-expanding landscape of the early internet, was, in a way, a psychedelic vision. The people who built the internet weren't corporate suits. They were hippies with soldering irons, dropouts with a vision. They saw the internet the same way Timothy Leary saw LSD. A tool for expanding consciousness. A way to break free from the rigid top-down structure of the world. But like every countercultural movement, it didn't stay underground forever. 4. The commodification of psychedelia. Now fast forward 30 years. Psychedelics are back, but they don't look the same. They're not being passed around at underground raves. They're in boardrooms, being pitched in PowerPoint decks. They're not about breaking free from the system. They're about optimizing your performance within it. Microdosing for productivity. Psychedelic therapy for burnout. The same drugs that once tore down walls are now being used to keep workers happy, efficient, and compliant. In the internet, same thing happened. What started as a digital Wild West built by tripping visionaries who saw it as a tool for liberation got swallowed whole by corporations. The open frontier became a walled garden with algorithms deciding what you see, what you think, and what you buy. The tools of rebellion don't stay rebellious forever. Eventually, they get repackaged, resold, and turned into just another product. But for a brief, fleeting moment, Gen X had psychedelics before the corporations did, before they became another Silicon Valley side hustle, before they were just another thing you could order off an app. For a moment, they were a ticket out of the ordinary, a glimpse at something bigger, a way to see beyond the static. And in a world that was about to go digital, that kind of clarity was a rare, beautiful thing. Please, like, subscribe, and don't be a poser.